Anguirus, rival, ally, and friend to the Showa Era's king of the monsters, Godzilla. While metaphorically and literally at each other's throats at the start of the film franchise, the two species quickly solidified more amicable terms. So much so that I'd argue of all of Godzilla's allies, it is Anguirus who can claim to be the king's closest. But what if their initial meeting had gone differently? What if fate claimed another life during their final battle, leaving the fierce dragon with his own? What if Anguirus replaced Godzilla's Showa? For this rather straightforward scenario during the holiday season, a scenario that I should note was selected by Alpha Titan YouTube member Galork. The only thing which needs clarification is how. How would the first Anguirus possibly best Godzilla? The atomic reptile's fiery breath, coupled with his super regeneration, makes this a difficult outcome for any monster to obtain. But I do have two slight changes we could make to ensure this outcome occurs. The first is that we give this Anguirus a slight buff to his strength and size. Perhaps when awakened by nuclear testing, the radiation bestowed a minor bit of growth, unlike in the original timeline. More important is the second change I'd recommend, which is having the second Godzilla close by to the first Godzilla's death in 1954. Exposure to the oxygen destroyer to a level approaching death isn't necessary here. All that the scenario needs is this Godzilla hampered enough by the effects of the weapon to give Anguirus an edge. So whether in Osaka or on the remote island of Iwato, Anguirus Prime claims victory over a weakened future king that never attains his crown. Now you might be asking what the immediate effects of removing Godzilla from the Showa Era are, but the better question to ask is, how does Anguirus differ from the original Godzilla? Are they each not violent beasts, certain to ensure Japan has no future? Well, according to Dr. Yamane, Anguirus is a creature that is naturally antagonistic toward violent monsters, which makes sense when you consider the rest of the Showa era. Godzilla early on in the era is treated usually as a villain, while later films demonstrate a more heroic side of the character. Thus it makes sense the second Anguirus would naturally find common ground and eventually a strong friendship with the less violent, later incarnation of the King of the Monsters. So while Anguirus Prime and Godzilla were both awakened and irradiated by nuclear testing, it's likely the mutated ankylosaur would not raid Japan again after Godzilla's defeat. Instead, he'd likely return to where he came from, which was Iwato Island. That is until 1956. Upon Kyushu Meganula run rampant, signaling the rise of two aerial terrors, a male and female Rodan. As the pair's trail of high-speed destruction strikes Fukuoka, Anguirus Prime would likely investigate and aggressively combat the supersonic terrors, once he deduced their destructive nature. Thing is, each side is poorly positioned to win this matchup. That might sound strange, especially in a 2v1 situation, but the question you should be asking, not which is stronger or which is more durable, but how could each side possibly win this battle? The obvious answer for the Rodans is dropping Anguirus from a great height, shown with how Rodan fought Godzilla later on in the Showa series. A fall which likely won't do much to a species shown to survive such terminal impacts. The next obvious tactic for the mates would be using their claws or beaks, but for a relatively low to the ground quadruped such as Anguirus, one with a nigh impenetrable spiked shell, using their claws or beaks could prove costly. Anguirus could easily jump them, and once on the ground, either Rodan could be helpless. An outcome I can't see the cunning avians falling for. So, unable to really best the other, I think the Rodans would just fly home after a prolonged and meaningless conflict. The tenacious ankylosaur would follow, causing Anguirus Prime to be caught up in humanity's counterattack against the avians. Now, as a volcanic beast, I doubt the eruption would do much to Anguirus, meaning he's unaffected by the lava spewing from the volcano, while the Rodans are entombed by the nearby volcanic reaction caused by humanity's attack. With the pair bested, Anguirus likely returns to his home on Iwato Island, not reappearing until the year 1958. Now, the Mysterian invasion of 1957 would still occur, but without a monster to attract Anguirus, he likely wouldn't care all that much. That can't be said, however, with Varan, whose destructive rampage upon being awakened lures the ankylosaur inland once more. Now, between the experienced fierce dragon and the unbelievable guardian, my money is on Anguirus remaining the victor. By this point, I think Japan would come to realize that Anguirus is not a threat. Honestly, he's more so a guardian, just as he would have been in the initial draft of Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, giant monsters all-out attack. A sleeping, spiked protector which awakens in times of need to combat violent creatures which run rampant upon Japan's shores. An opinion affirmed in 1960 when Baragon's rampage of destruction and human loss across the countryside is cut short by Anguirus' arrival. Frankenstein, a giant at this point, likely still intervenes to protect humans nearby, turning the fight into a vicious 2v1. But Baragon really has no hope of winning this confrontation. And with the mutant possessing a noble soul, Anguirus wouldn't sense any violent nature within the humanoid, meaning unlike in Frankenstein Conquers the World, the star Kaiju doesn't die here. Now instead of the volcanic reaction, I'm going with Daku's arrival at the end of the fight as the canon ending, and the one that will be used in this scenario. The thing is, with Anguirus and Frankenstein able to fight the giant octopus, the thing is, he's gonna be nothing more than a hard-fought meal. A meal which solidifies the alliance between man and beast. Even if a protector, Japan most likely wouldn't accept Frankenstein within the country. I mean, positive public sentiment toward the monsters can only go so far. So where to place the giant? The obvious answer is the island of Owato, turning it into a home for two fierce giants, a land populated by monsters. Another year passes by. Infant Island is discovered, summoning the wrath of Mothra when her priestesses are taken. Would her destructive wrath stoke Anguirus' fury? Would he and the Infant Island god come to blows? Well, not really. Mothra isn't a destructive beast. She's a guardian seeking to free her priestesses, a pair forced into an indentured servitude against their own will. So when god and dragon meet, there isn't a clash, just a conversation. Remember, in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Mothra larva communicates with Godzilla and Rodan. Nothing should stop Mothra here from doing the same with Anguirus. Also, whether the larva or in imago form, Mothra's sheer size would definitely give Anguirus Prime pause to hear her out, if he does think she is a violent creature. So what is the outcome of this conversation? Well, not great things for Relisica. Mothra and Anguirus appear in New Kirk City, forcing the city's people to find and release the Shobogen before it's too late. Another alliance is formed between Reptile and God, but one has to wonder, would this happen again? Would King Kong do the same? In my opinion, not so much. If the events of King Kong vs. Godzilla still occur for the titular ape, with the Pacific Pharmaceutical Company transporting King Kong to Japan, I can't see the military allowing Kong entry on Japanese soil. King Kong thus awakens, is blown up, then heads for solid ground. What differs in this timeline is where King Kong goes. He wouldn't sense anything on Japan's mainland with no Godzilla running amok, so there is no reason he would swim in that direction. Instead, he charts a course for Owato Island, picking a fight with Anguirus and Frankenstein. To make something abundantly clear, if electrified, I can't see either of the pairs surviving this scenario. The American Frankenstein, a creature born of electricity, the humanoid is not. Plus, King Kong canonically bested Godzilla, who killed Anguirus. Even if Anguirus Prime is tougher, my gut says Kong should still win this more often than not. So to avoid this scenario turning into what if King Kong killed Godzilla, I'm going to say that luck doesn't favor the ape on this day. There is no storm, no power for King Kong to draw from. Anguirus and Frankenstein defending themselves and their own territory and relying on teamwork, tenacity, and probably a bunch of fire, overwhelm Faroe Island's king. Now with that dramatic deviation, one I'm sure that won't cause any comments down below, another period of quiet is welcomed by Japan. A silence broken by the appearance of Mothra's egg. With no Godzilla and Anguirus firmly as an ally, the adult Mothra doesn't hasten her own untimely demise here, meaning she and her kids peacefully return to Infant Island once they hatch. Also, without the threat of Godzilla, the larvae don't need to rush their hatching by hours if not days. They can fully grow, so it's unlikely either perish due to sickness brought upon by an early birth. So when Ghidorah descends from the stars, the Hydra is forced to contend with 5 monsters in this scenario instead of 3. Again, Anguirus is on good terms with Frankenstein and the Mothras, while Rodan, after he reappears, may be a bit of a wild card at first, Wanting a rematch with Anguirus, I think it'd be a lot easier in this scenario to convince him to fight with the other monsters. Mothra would no doubt have Anguirus' ear by this time, and if the ankylosaur stops fighting, I think the pterosaur would be open to listening to what the god of Infant Island has to say. So in a 5v1 with Anguirus, both Larva, Frankenstein, and Rodan, Ghidorah is thoroughly beaten, forcing him to retreat to the stars, where Exilian ambitions make use of the weakened dragon, though they would be unable to follow through on the rest of their original plan. I mean, by this point, the Japanese self-defense force would most likely accept Anguirus, Frankenstein, and Mothra as monsters which generally benefit Japan, if not humanity at large. So the Exilians can't reasonably request to take the monsters here. Rodan is definitely an exception, sure, but the rest, not so much. Whether the Exilians just attack with Ghidorah then, or play another angle of subterfuge to get control of the monsters, ultimately it's down to humanity, specifically Tetsuo Tori and his personal alarm, to permanently end the alien threat. Now personally, I think humanity, especially with US support, just has the numbers and home field advantage to beat the Exilians in a long-term conflict over Earth's future. Though for the sake of this scenario, we'll assume Tetsuo can get his invention to the masses, allowing humanity to successfully counterattack and free the monsters. As the Exilians are beaten, it may come as a shock that the rest of the Showa era pivots back to a somewhat familiar timeline, with 3 minor exceptions. For one, there is no War of the Gargantuas, with Frankenstein still alive and kicking. There's also no red bamboo here, because with 2 larvae, it's doubtful both Mothras would enter the same comatose-like state. If natives are kidnapped, the other Mothra's wrath would descend upon the terrorist organization. And lastly, with no Godzilla, there is probably no one to come to Minya's aid when he hatches, or at least no one that can come to his aid quickly enough before his future is scrambled. On the sunnier side of things, 6 years would pass with little monstrous activity, meaning humanity would be able to enjoy the calm, enjoy 6 years to rebuild what had been destroyed, at least until the intergalactic terror that is Ghidorah falls from the sky. And it's here the reality of the Showa era comes crashing down upon Anguirus and his allies. I can't see any of them being able to slow Ghidorah's growth, and without some way to kill the smog monster, by the time the pollution-eating entity reaches its final form, no monster would really stand a chance. Ghidorah here can end all life on Earth. And once again, it's down to humanity to beat the Triphibian. Apologies for the interruption, but by far most of you are not subscribed. To stay up to date with these future releases, please consider doing so, or at the very least, leaving a like. Thank you. The one thing I can say to Japan's credit is I can't see the military doing absolutely nothing like in the original film. Excluding the electrodes, the Japanese self-defense force just doesn't ever engage Ghidorah head-on in Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, even though their weapons like the maser tanks or electricity towers would be immensely effective against the smog monster. So for the 3rd time, this is another point where the scenario could just end. No fault to Anguirus, as this is just a staple of the Showa era, where humans just play a pivotal role in winning the day against alien threats. Though let's assume humanity is able to overcome the smog monster with some monstrous support. Well, when Gigan and Ghidorah invade on behalf of the Space Hunter and Nebula M aliens, Anguirus Prime, the 2nd Anguirus of the Showa era, who would no doubt find the other member of his species by now, Mothra, Frankenstein, and Rodan, or some combination of the group, are definitely strong enough to combat the alien threat. Do I think all these monsters would appear? No, but I think 3 or 4 of them would do wonders against the pair. Also, in this scenario, because there were 2 Mothras, and if let's say each have an egg, and those have 2 Mothras each, the Mothra population could quickly start to increase by a considerable amount. Though back to the fight, out of all the matchups, Frankenstein vs. Gigan is the one I'd definitely like to see the most. A monster which can regenerate from any wound, fighting the living switchblade that is Gigan. Primitive man versus cybernetic killer. Living ingenuity battling to overcome lethal supremacy. So long as they stay away from... Actually, now that I think about it, what would the tower resemble? Because it wouldn't be Godzilla, because Godzilla never has his redemption arc. And having a killer, or a monster that has killed thousands of Japanese, would definitely be not the icon to learn a whole bunch of children, or like create a children land. So I guess Anguirus, but regardless, whatever the building resembles, Rodan or Mothra are the two best kaiju to ensure the tower's destruction. Because a tower which looks only in one direction won't last long against two highly maneuverable monsters. Or at least whichever of the two monsters show up for this fight. With Rodan staying on Awato Island or Monsterland, I would genuinely think that he'd be the one to join this fight, wanting another round to best Ghidorah. The alien pair retreat with the Space Hunter Nebula M alien's destruction, setting the stage for a Megalon's rise and ultimate failure in the following year. If Anguirus fought with just Jet Jaguar, I could see things being a bit dicey, but so long as a single monster like Old Reliable Frankenstein comes to his aid, or the other Anguirus, the goddess Utopia will be beaten back into the depths, no matter how much Gigan may attempt to stem the tide. Thus, we slowly approach the end of this scenario with the arrival of the black hole aliens. An alien threat that is definitely not picking Godzilla for the basis of their mech. The same logic here would follow with Godzilla Tower. They wouldn't pick a monster that was handedly beaten many years ago. And like Walter Simmons in the MonsterVerse, their creation is meant to imitate and surpass the known strongest. So in a direct battle, without the Deus Ex Machina that is Magnet Godzilla, their mech will win every battle. The Anguirus pair, multiple Mothras, Rodan, King Caesar, all will fall to the alien's death machine, whatever form it takes. At least until humanity blows up their main base of operations, leaving the mech helpless to fight whatever monsters are still alive and able to rip and tear through space titanium. A fate surely to reoccur in the following year, no matter how unbeatable their creation would be with Titanosaurus by their side. Because Terror of Mechagodzilla, even if Mechagodzilla and Titanosaurus aren't fighting Godzilla, humanity, or at least a small group of humans, will still end the alien threat. So what if Anguirus replaced Godzilla Showa? Well, for the first half of the era, the noble fierce dragon will do more good than harm, acting as a living shield for Japan against the worst monsters of the 1950s and 60s. He'll gain his own unique allies, like Frankenstein, a clever mutant and friend who will fight by the Saurian side to the bitter end. It is only when alien threats descend from the stars that the shield composed of Anguirus and his allies will be overwhelmed, forcing humanity to take the mantle of Earth's true protectors, for better or for worse. And that concludes this Alpha Titan selected scenario chosen by Galork, the first member of What If Kaiju and a guy making videos like this possible for you to enjoy. Though if you would like your own scenario to be covered on the channel, just like the multi-month mega supporter that is Galork, become a member of What If Kaiju today. Next up on the channel, we have What If Zilla Was in the MonsterVerse Part 2, a very anticipated sequel I know, and one that I will ensure is worth the wait. With all that said, I'm GrayShot151, and I'll see you all next time. Until then, later.